In the heart of Paris, on the Rue de Rivoli, sits a building that most tourists walk past without a second glance. It is the French Treasury, a fortress of beige stone and iron gates that has guarded the financial secrets of the French state for over 2 centuries. But behind those gates, in a vault deep underground, lies something that shouldn't exist in the 21st century. Stacked in rows are the foreign currency reserves of 14 African nations, billions of dollars that belong to countries like Senegal, Ivory Coast, and Cameroon, money that was earned by African workers, taxed by African businesses, and saved by African governments. But the Africans cannot touch it, they cannot spend it, they cannot even count it without French permission, because the money is held hostage by a monetary system that was designed in 1945 to keep the French Empire alive long after the colonies were supposed to be free. The system is called the CFA Franc. The letters originally stood for Colonie Française d'Afrique, French Colonies of Africa. After independence, the French diplomatically changed it to Communauté Financière Africaine, African Financial Community. The name changed, the chains did not. Today, in 2024, 14 African countries use a currency that is printed in France, managed by the French Treasury, and backed by reserves that are locked in Paris. It is the longest-running monetary con in modern history, a colonial relic that extracts wealth from some of the poorest nations on earth and funnels it directly to one of the richest. To understand how this system was created and why it still exists, you have to go back to the moment when the French Empire was dying but refused to admit it. The year was 1945. The war in Europe had just ended. France had been humiliated, occupied, and nearly destroyed. The French state was bankrupt, the economy was in ruins. But one thing remained intact: the empire. France still controlled vast territories in Africa, from the deserts of the Sahel to the rainforests of Central Africa. The colonies had been a source of wealth for centuries, providing raw materials, cheap labor, and captive markets for French goods. The French elite knew that if they lost the colonies, France would be reduced to a second-rate European power. But the world was changing. The United Nations Charter spoke of self-determination. The Atlantic Charter promised freedom for colonized peoples. Anti-colonial movements were stirring in Asia and Africa. The writing was on the wall. The age of formal empire was ending. The French understood this, but they also understood something else. You don't need to own a country to control it. You just need to own its money. In 1945, the French government established the CFA Franc as the common currency for its African colonies. The official justification was monetary stability. The franc would be pegged to the French franc and later to the euro, giving the African economies a solid anchor. In exchange for this stability, the African colonies would have to follow certain rules. They would deposit their foreign currency reserves with the French Treasury.
They would allow France to manage the printing and distribution of the currency. And they would give France veto power over their monetary policy. It sounded like a reasonable technical arrangement between a mother country and its dependent territories. But here's what they didn't say. The rules meant that these African nations could never control their own money supply. They could never devalue their currency to make their exports more competitive. They could never print money to finance infrastructure or stimulate their economies during recessions. Every major economic decision had to be approved by bureaucrats in Paris who had no accountability to African voters. It was sovereignty in name only. When the wave of independence swept across Africa in the 1960s, France faced a dilemma. They couldn't hold the colonies by force. The cost was too high, and the international pressure was too great. So they made a deal. They would grant political independence. The Africans could have their flags, their national anthems, their seats at the United Nations, but the monetary system would stay exactly as it was. The new African leaders could call themselves presidents, but they would still have to keep their money in Paris. Most of the newly independent governments accepted this bargain. They had no choice. France made it clear that any country that refused would be cut off from French aid, French markets, and French military protection. In the chaos of decolonization, that was a death sentence. So one by one, the new nations signed the agreements that kept them tied to the CFA system. They traded the substance of independence for the appearance of it. The mechanics of the system are brutally simple. Every CFA country must deposit at least 50% of its foreign currency reserves with the French Treasury. In practice, the percentage is often much higher. These reserves are not just symbolic, they represent real wealth. When a company in Senegal exports peanuts to China and gets paid in dollars, those dollars don't stay in Senegal. They are transferred to an account at the French Treasury called the operations account. The CFA countries earn a modest interest rate on these deposits, usually around 0.75%, but they cannot withdraw the money without French approval. And if they run a deficit and need to access their own reserves, they have to borrow them back from France, often at higher interest rates. Think about the absurdity of that arrangement. It would be like you depositing your salary into someone else's bank account and then having to ask them for permission to spend your own money and pay them interest for the privilege. It is financial servitude dressed up in the language of technical cooperation. But the exploitation goes deeper. The CFA franc is pegged to the euro at a fixed rate. This peg is guaranteed by the French Treasury, which sounds generous until you understand what it means in practice. The peg keeps the CFA franc artificially strong. This makes imports from France and Europe cheap.
French companies can sell their goods into African markets at prices that undercut local producers, but it makes African exports expensive and uncompetitive on the global market. An African farmer trying to sell cotton or coffee is competing with producers from Asia and Latin America who have cheaper currencies. The overvalued CFA franc is a hidden tariff that protects French business interests while strangling African economic development. The numbers tell the story. France runs a massive trade surplus with the CFA zone. In recent years, French exports to these 14 countries have exceeded imports by billions of euros annually. France sells them cars, machinery, pharmaceuticals, and luxury goods. In return, France buys raw materials, cocoa, uranium, oil, gold. It is the classic colonial trade pattern. The African countries are locked into a position as suppliers of cheap commodities and consumers of expensive manufactured goods, and the currency system ensures they cannot escape this trap. The human cost is staggering. The CFA zone includes some of the poorest countries on earth: Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad. These are nations where the average person lives on less than $2 a day. They are rich in resources. Niger has some of the largest uranium deposits in the world. Ivory Coast is the world's biggest cocoa producer. Yet the wealth flows out. The uranium powers French nuclear reactors, the cocoa becomes French chocolate, and the profits are deposited in the operations account in Paris, where they sit earning 0.75% interest, while French banks use them to make loans at 5 or 10%. Some African leaders have tried to break free. The most famous was Thomas Sankara, the president of Burkina Faso. Sankara came to power in 1983 with a radical vision. He wanted to transform his country from a dependent client state into a self-sufficient nation. He launched literacy campaigns, vaccination programs, and land reforms. He planted 10 million trees to stop desertification. He banned female genital mutilation and promoted women's rights. And he spoke openly about the injustice of the CFA franc. In a speech at the Organization of African Unity in 1987, Sankara called the foreign debt a form of neo-colonialism. He urged African nations to refuse to pay debts that had been imposed by colonial powers and used to keep Africa poor. 4 months later, Thomas Sankara was assassinated. He was gunned down in a coup led by his former friend Blaise Compaoré, who immediately reversed Sankara's policies and restored friendly relations with France. Compaoré would rule Burkina Faso for the next 27 years with French support. The message was clear: leaders who challenge the system do not survive. The pattern repeated itself. In 2011, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya proposed the creation of a pan-African currency, the gold dinar, that would allow African nations to trade without using the dollar or the euro. Gaddafi had the resources to make it happen.
Libya had billions in foreign reserves and significant gold holdings. He began reaching out to African leaders, offering to back the new currency with Libyan gold. French President Nicolas Sarkozy was reportedly furious. Internal French government documents later revealed that one of the primary reasons for the French-led military intervention in Libya was to prevent Gaddafi's monetary project. Within months, NATO bombs were falling on Tripoli. Gaddafi was killed by rebels backed by French special forces. Libya descended into chaos, and the gold dinar died with him. The CFA system survived because it serves powerful interests. For France, it provides economic benefits that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. French companies operating in the CFA zone have a built-in advantage. They can repatriate profits easily because there are no currency controls between the CFA countries and France. French banks dominate the financial sector in these countries. French construction firms win the infrastructure contracts. And perhaps most importantly, the system gives France geopolitical leverage. The African countries in the CFA zone consistently vote with France at the United Nations and support French foreign policy positions. It is an economic empire that generates political power. For the African elites who run these countries, the system also has benefits, at least for them personally. The fixed exchange rate and the backing of the French Treasury create an illusion of stability that makes it easier to attract some foreign investment. More cynically, the system makes capital flight easier. When a corrupt official in Gabon or Cameroon steals millions from the state budget, they can easily convert CFA francs into euros and move the money to a French bank account. There are no currency controls to stop them. The system that impoverishes ordinary Africans enriches the kleptocrats who rule them. And France, which lectures the world about democracy and human rights, has propped up these dictators for decades because they keep the CFA system running. The technical defense of the CFA franc is that it provides monetary stability. Proponents argue that by pegging to the euro and limiting money printing, the system prevents the hyperinflation and currency crises that have plagued other African countries. There is some truth to this. The CFA zone has not experienced the kind of catastrophic inflation seen in Zimbabwe or the currency collapses seen in Ghana or Nigeria. But this stability comes at a crushing price. It is the stability of stagnation. The CFA countries have consistently lower growth rates than comparable African nations with their own currencies. They have higher unemployment, lower industrialization, and greater poverty. You cannot build an economy when you cannot control your own money supply or adjust your exchange rate to changing conditions. There have been moments when reforms seemed possible. In 2019, French President Emmanuel Macron announced with great fanfare that the CFA franc would be reformed. He said the system was outdated and needed to change. The name would be changed from CFA to ECO. The requirement to hold reserves in Paris would be reduced. It sounded like progress. But when the details emerged, it became clear that nothing fundamental had changed. The currency would still be pegged to the euro. France would still guarantee the peg. The ECO would still be printed in France. The only real change was cosmetic, a rebranding designed to deflect criticism while preserving the essentials of the system. The most damning evidence of the system's failure is the flow of people. Millions of young Africans from CFA countries are risking their lives to migrate to Europe. They're drowning in the Mediterranean, suffocating in the backs of trucks, dying in the Sahara Desert. They are fleeing countries that are rich in resources but poor in opportunities. And one of the reasons their countries cannot create jobs or build industries is that their monetary systems are designed to extract wealth rather than generate it. The migration crisis that Europe complains about is partly the consequence of the economic model that Europe itself imposed and continues to enforce. Critics of the CFA system are often dismissed as conspiracy theorists or anti-French agitators. French officials insist that the system is voluntary, that any country can leave if it wants. This is technically true but practically meaningless. The few countries that have attempted to leave the CFA zone have faced severe retaliation. When Guinea left in 1960 under the leadership of Ahmed Sékou Touré, France responded with what can only be described as economic sabotage. French officials destroyed infrastructure on their way out. They burned documents, disabled power plants, and even poured concrete down the plumbing of government buildings. Guinea was made an example of what happens when you defy France. The only country that successfully left the CFA franc and thrived was Mauritania, which exited in 1973 and created its own currency. Mauritania is not rich, but it has maintained monetary independence and has not suffered the kind of stagnation seen in the CFA zone. This proves that the system is not necessary for stability. It is only necessary for French control. In recent years, pressure on the CFA system has been growing. A new generation of African activists, economists, and politicians are speaking out. They are making the case in social media, in universities, and in the streets that the CFA franc is a tool of neo-colonial exploitation. The hashtag #FrancAfrique has gone viral. Protests have erupted in multiple countries. The younger generation is less willing to accept the excuses and the justifications that their parents' generation tolerated. But France has proven remarkably adept at defending the system. They have co-opted some critics by offering minor reforms. They have dismissed others as Russian or Chinese agents trying to undermine French influence. And when necessary, they have used covert and overt pressure to ensure that governments in the CFA zone stay in line. French military bases are still scattered across Africa, officially there to fight terrorism, but also serving as a not-so-subtle reminder of who holds the ultimate power. The CFA Franc is the proof that colonialism did not end in the 1960s, it just went underground. The flags came down, the governors went home, but the financial architecture of empire remained intact. Today, when French politicians talk about development aid to Africa, they rarely mention that much of that aid is financed by the reserves that African countries are forced to keep in Paris. It is a circular con. France lends Africans their own money and calls it generosity. The system also reveals a darker truth about the international order. The United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, all of these institutions speak the language of sovereignty and development, but they have been silent about the CFA Franc. They have not condemned it as a violation of monetary sovereignty. They have not called for its abolition. This silence is not accidental. The global financial system is built on hierarchies, and those hierarchies are enforced not just by markets, but by power. The CFA Franc exists because France has the military, diplomatic, and economic clout to maintain it, and because the rest of the world either benefits from it or doesn't care enough to challenge it. There is a bitter irony in the fact that France, which takes pride in its revolutionary history and its commitment to liberty, equality, and fraternity, is the architect of one of the most sophisticated systems of economic exploitation in the modern world. The same country that lectures others about human rights and democracy has quietly drained billions from some of the poorest people on the planet. And they have done it not with soldiers in chains, but with interest rates and reserve requirements. The future of the CFA Franc is uncertain. The system is under pressure as never before. African intellectuals and activists are building a movement for monetary liberation. Some countries, like Mali and Burkina Faso, are experimenting with new alliances and exploring alternatives. There is talk of creating new regional currencies that would be truly African, not just African in name. But the obstacles are immense. France will not give up this system easily. It is too profitable, too strategically valuable, and the African elites who benefit from the status quo have no incentive to change it. But change is coming, whether France likes it or not. The young people drowning in the Mediterranean, the activists marching in the streets, the economists writing papers exposing the system, they are all part of a rising tide that will eventually sweep away the colonial relics of the past. The question is not whether the CFA Franc will end, but when and how much damage will be done before it finally collapses. The CFA Franc is a reminder that the most effective form of control is the kind that people don't see. When you own the printing press, you don't need to own the land. When you control the currency, you don't need to control the government. The CFA system is the ultimate proof that economic power is the foundation of all other forms of power. And as long as 14 African nations keep their reserves in Paris, France will remain an imperial power in everything but name. If you think there's something we missed or a topic you want us to cover, let's discuss it in the comments. Subscribe now and stay ahead. When history is written, you'll be one of the few who saw it coming.